a warm welcome on behalf of the whole team to everyone who's taken the time to join us. We look forward to hearing from you a little bit later after our presentation. The slides are being controlled remotely by someone else, so I'm going to just have to nudge along. Apologies that will interrupt the flow of things, but if whoever's in charge could just push us onto the agenda, that would be great. Thanks. So here's a kind of a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover in the next little while, specifically a tour of the work that we've been doing at the university, really to reframe the domestic retrofit challenge to help improve energy policy design, improve retrofit finance offers, but ultimately really just to scale the delivery of retrofit in line with decarbonisation targets. But before we jump into that, who are we to be taking up your time on those subjects? So we're a team of researchers at the University of Leeds who have been working on different aspects of energy, climate and sustainability over a number of years. Lucy is an expert in sustainable consumption and energy poverty, and is a geospatial quantitative data expert interested in energy demographics. Ruth led our qualitative work on retrofit in the community and is interested in questions of governance, all of which will be elaborated later when they join and contribute to the presentation. And I'm Mark, as Louise said, and I've led a number of projects with public and private sector partners to co-create innovative green finance solutions, specifically for local net zero infrastructure delivery. So just last month, we decided to bring all of this work together to form the Leeds Relational Energy Group. And as the slide here shows, LREG has expertise in these kind of four primary areas, which I mentioned are kind of driven by each one of us. But it's really in our collaborative work on retrofit, which we've been sharing with teams at DESNZ, UK Infrastructure Bank, major kind of high street banking groups, as well as with local and combined authorities. It's that work on retrofit that we want to talk about with you today as part of this series. So thanks again for the invitation to contribute. The reason we want to focus on this is because we believe that energy policy and green finance options are actually missing a vital barrier to the delivery of retrofit at scale, and that is namely people's social relations. Now, we'll elaborate in more detail as we go along exactly what we mean by that, and thankfully I have the task right at the top here of just setting up the broad contours of what we mean by a relational approach to retrofit, and my colleagues will say a little bit more as we go along. But just as a kind of way into our way of thinking, one of the missteps still being made on retrofit in both policy and finance spaces is the enduring belief that people act rationally with their money. So the thinking goes, if only we can nudge the right lever to find the right strike price for making retrofit cost effective, and typically that's framed as kind of marginal annual bill savings, then people will immediately flock to retrofit their homes in the hundreds of thousands. We disagree with that and have been using insights from economic sociology to begin to pull apart a whole series of assumptions in that kind of very basic appeal to the idea that people are rational economic actors. First, the data that we have that we'll go on to talk about shows that people don't act rationally with their money. Instead, they go through a process that we call earmarking of money into different pots based upon their relationships with within and beyond the home. And also that how money comes into a household, whether it's received as a gift, as a payment such as salary, or an entitlement, has a material impact on how homes then earmark that money, and that kind of shapes how it's spent. The other reason for looking kind of beyond finance for some of the barriers to retrofit is that, you know, while retrofit finance is clearly important, taking a look at the UK's home renovation spend reveals that access to finance is really not the primary barrier. At around 22 billion per year, there is plenty of retail spend on home improvements and renovations. So the question is, why isn't retrofit for energy efficiency a mainstream part of all of this home renovation activity for those who are evidently able to pay? So this was the starting point for one of the big projects that the team's been leading in this space, the Whole Person, Whole Place project, which was funded by the UK Energy Research Centre. Between 2021 and 2023, we studied the renovation and retrofit activities of different categories of households right across the UK. We looked at owner-occupiers in Otley here in Leeds, multiple occupancy properties up in Glasgow, and private rented homes in Brighton. In each case study, we were interested in how people's social relations with family, friends, and other community stakeholders acted as either opportunities or barriers to them engaging in retrofit activity. We were guided in all three cases by questions on how social demographics, identity, geography, and tenure type impacted their decision making, and also which kinds of money were being earmarked as appropriate for this kind of work. And with that setup, I'll hand over to Ruth to explain what we found in more detail.
Thanks, Mark. So, yeah, so I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from the Whole Person, Whole Place project, and that's really looking at how relations with friends and family, relations associated with identity, relations with communities and agencies, relations associated with money, come together to influence and shape how people make decisions to retrofit their homes. So it's really about thinking about how retrofit happens at different life moments. So, this could be as part of a wider renovation, response to a crisis, moving home, or perhaps a change in a family circumstance. But also thinking about the reason why you're retrofitting and also how that might shape what you get done. So for instance, if your boiler breaks, you're unlikely to switch technology entirely to a heat pump. So firstly, retrofit is for households, not individuals. So people make decisions about their homes on whether or not, on how it suits sort of current and future needs. So if this could be a growing family, changes to deal with accessibility as you get older, also about making spaces suit those relations better. So we spoke to people who wanted to make the spaces that they lived in more open, warmer, just for having more children and being able to host people in a bigger space. People will take advice from friends, family, and their wider social networks and trusted local actors. So this comes back to communities and agencies. And these networks are really important, firstly for building trust in tradespeople that they're working with. So a lot of time this will come through personal recommendation. Also the sort of types of works that are being done. So for instance, if you see somebody getting a new technology or engaging with specific grads and it goes well, you'll be more likely to ask them about it and to engage with that work yourself. And then also it's important to note how some people are more likely to engage with different types of policies than other. And we're going to be coming to this a bit later about how different socio-demographic backgrounds and shapes of identity shape how people engage and whether or not they're more likely to engage. And we've found some really strong evidence on that in terms of energy grants. And knowing how these different factors shape people's willingness to engage with energy policy can be really helpful in thinking about how to sort of target that demographic and also broaden that. And then on the sort of question about money, we know retrofit is expensive. And as Mark said, it's not just about finding the right financial package, right? So we know from economic sociology that people understand and use different kinds of money differently. And this is shaped by their relationships. So people want to spend the right type of money on retrofit in the right way. And we found this most clearly in our interviews in people's strong aversion to using any kind of debt to do works on their homes. Whereas money around inheritance might be spent differently and was seen as something that people could allocate towards renovations and improving their living space. So we see this in terms of sort of making things about policy, is it's not just being about the right financial option, because as this one interviewee said, the father said the heaviest thing can hang around your neck is debt. So this person would then be far more unlikely to engage with a policy that they would believe increased their indebtedness. So on this question of identity and energy demographics, this links to work that our colleague Anne Owen has done on who applies for energy grants, and using a combination of historical data on energy grant applications, for instance, ECO, with ONS data on neighborhood characteristics, she was able to create a picture of who was making these applications for energy grants, and found the strongest correlation between applicants and neighborhood types was with households with an Asian ethnic minority living in terraced housing and on a low income. And she found that these houses were 6 times more likely to apply for ECO than white terraced housing, low income households, and 12 times more likely to apply than the UK average. So this is something that really speaks to perhaps the importance of a relational approach in engaging with people, because this was something that held true in other northern industrial cities with similar housing types and people with similar backgrounds. So it really spoke to the fact that this was something about relations with identity that was possibly encouraging the spread of grants. And you can see from this visual that's created about how grants have spread through, and you can see from the red to late 2014 through the orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. And this is how the grants are spreading through this neighborhood in Bradford. And something that's important to note here is that this isn't based on a government scheme to target Asian ethnicity terrace households in particular. This wasn't based on an idea to target this neighborhood in Bradford specifically, but was based on sort of relations on people talking with their neighbors and the sort of housing type in the area. And as we found from doing interviews with some of these applicants, a really effective door-to-door recruitment policy that involved going to people, perhaps with a sort of NGO or a person who was known to households from sort of community centers, could speak critically, usually Urdu or Bengali in these areas, and were able to talk to people and sort of be a face of the policy and encouraging people to sign up for eco grants. And then what we found was that actually quite a high number of applicants were dropping out later on in the process. And this was partly due to the trust in the measures that were getting installed. So Bradford's had issues previously with sort of measures being installed in homes that have actually increased problems with damp. So they didn't necessarily, homeowners were a bit nervous about engaging with some of these. So that speaks to this process of trust in who's providing the work and that it's going to be appropriate for your home. But what was really important, we found, was family support in assisting you through the application process. So if you had a child in particular who was fluent in English and able to be with their parents, we found throughout the application process, looking at the grant, making sure the forms were all in order, being present when the tradespeople were in their homes, installing the works, to really just sort of have that extra reassurance that everything was happening as it should be and that it was going to run smoothly. And then what we also found from talking to people was that they didn't necessarily see an eco grant as an energy specific grant, but instead being part of wider social welfare. And this is an important policy implication for, how we sort of talk about these policies. This isn't just an energy policy. This is a policy about their homes, and people understand and engage with them differently depending on their background and circumstances. Comes through from our research, and the wider whole person whole place project involves 3 different case studies. So Otley, Bradford, Otley, and then Bradford was the second one, and then we also had colleagues working at Glasgow and the University of Sussex, and so we sort of look at how building types are common in particular places, how they might need different treatments, and sort of the local understanding of retrofit there is key, right? So then you also have similar people living in similar houses together. We see this really clearly in the Bradford work, where people with a similar background are living in the same sort of places, in the same sort of buildings, and how this shapes their engagement with energy policy. And that can also be helpful for, predicting and understanding outcomes and generating interest and trying to find those communities of people who are able to do. And that's something that Anne is going to come back to that. So this really comes to this point of place-based institutional support for retrofit being critical to success. Localized solutions are important here. And this can speak to the role of local NGOs, community centers, local businesses as well. Interviewees really liked it when they had a sort of business that was based in the community that had like a shop front that they could go and talk to, and also the role of local councils, local authorities that understand their areas, the places and the people within them. So what does this mean for policy? It means that people can be brought into retrofit into a range of ways. So you can be looking at the terrace dwellers, young families, people who have recently moved, targeting the interventions for people at different times in their lives, right? And also targeting people towards the specific types of dwellings that they're in. So for instance, if you're in a terraced house dweller in Bradford, the place-based approach is critical. You need these local actors there to build trust with these sort of communities and agencies that we have that are in place there and that really understand their communities. And then also the different types of money is really important to a successful retrofit policy. So you might want to tailor policy to think about how people are spending money at that particular life stage. So if we've spoken to people in the banking sector, and one thing that they brought up was this possibility of tax breaks on inheritance when spent on retrofit. And these sort of come together to bring together the people, the money, and the place to better inform retrofit policy, linking these three things together and understanding that successful policy has to think of these things holistically as opposed to individually, and really helping us find, as Mark Davis has put it, finding the able to do over the able to pay. So this isn't just about people who have the right type of money, but are able to mobilize it at the right time, and thinking about how these people might be geographically and spatially patterned, which is what Anne is going to talk about now on finding the able to do.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Ruth. So I was set with a task of identifying some low-hanging fruit, basically. Could we identify some postcodes in Leeds where we thought we had the right types of people living in the right types of homes who had the motivation to maybe take on a retrofit project? So we looked at the sorts of data, spatial data, that we could easily get hold of. So clearly we wanted to target homeowners because they have control over, well, more control over what they can actually do to their homes. And you can find out the tenure of a house from the UK census. We wanted these homes to have potential to be improved. So we used the EPC database and identified houses which were C and below. And finally, well, second to last, we wanted to look at homes that were reasonably well off. So we used the indices of multiple deprivation and identified households that were sitting in the top 2 quintiles. And then we wanted something that was almost a sort of people who were motivated to take on something. A retrofit project can be quite a challenging time, and so we thought perhaps people who were already quite keen on doing DIY, and we thought long and hard about what we could use to identify these types of people, and we settled on trying to find the sort of characteristics of homes that spent certain amounts of money on certain types of things. And we used the Living Costs and Food survey, and you can see a list of the types of consumable items that we selected as being DIY. And if you could move me on to the next slide, please, and I'll show you what we did with this Living Costs and Food survey data. So the first thing we thought about doing was splitting up households into sort of characteristics and identifying what the spend on DIY was for this. So we looked at income, we looked at dwelling type, we looked at age, and we looked at tenure, and we were getting some quite interesting results, showing that basically rich older people living in detached owned homes were high spenders. Next slide, please, Ruth. Then we thought about, well, hang on a minute, could it have something to do with the sort of household type? So we looked at household composition, and we found that it tended to be family homes that were spending the most. Then we thought, well, okay, how could we actually relate this spatially? And we hit upon the output area classification, which was one of the things that we used in the work where we found out about the Asian terraces. And we used the middle layer of the output area classification to use a pre-existing geodemographic classification grouping to look at who were high spenders. And we decided to use this one in the end because it's spatially located and it seemed to make sense. So we selected households belonging to the parts shown up in purple here as being the types of households who are high DIY spenders. So you end up with sort of rural dwellers, those badged as aspiring and affluents, Asian traits and suburban achievers as being our high DIY spenders. And then we put all of this data together to try and select those individual postcodes that met all of these characteristics. And this is shown here in this selection tree. So basically, if you throw in all 30,000 postcodes in the Leeds metropolitan area and you extract out those that are low income, you remove those that aren't homeowners, you remove them where there just isn't enough data on EPC, you only keep the households that can be improved. Then you start to look at income, then you look at whether they're in the DIY group. Our top rated postcodes for areas where we think we could potentially target people for retrofit, there's actually only around 3% of these postcodes in Leeds. So those are the ones that are marked in green. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Leeds area, but there seems to be a clustering of these potential areas where we think you could target in the sort of northern leafy suburbs of Leeds. And if we could just go to the next slide where I've got a zoom in of that particular square. So we've got sort of areas towards the north of Roundhay where we do find quite wealthy people living in older, larger homes, and we have households which are characterised as those people who like to take on DIY projects. And this sort of thought exercise, we think could be something that could be rolled out by local authorities to use to basically target people who could take on the funding of this work themselves, and a sort of a shortcut to identifying areas where you could potentially do some kind of, I don't know, leaflet campaign or something like that. So I think that's the end of me, and I'm now passing on to Lucy.
Take my mute off. Thank you. Okay, just for the last 5 minutes, I just want to sort of take you through some kind of insights into working with academics. We've just prepared a few slides on this. So if I go to the next one, Rue. We wanted to capture really here the numerous benefits of working with a university, with academics within a university. And maybe, I mean, you can see all sorts of things on the slide there. The things I would like to say to summarise this are that it's a kind of opportunity working with universities to be inspired to think slightly differently about things. And I hope that's what we've shown you today in terms of the way we approach retrofit, which is a bit different to the ways that people tend to talk about this problem. Also a chance to co-produce useful results, and so it's worth saying that, you know, some of the work that you've seen was absolutely co-produced with Leeds City Council, with George Munson, who was at Leeds City Council at the time, also with Otley Energy, the community energy group in Otley, and then as a result of them co-producing those results with us, they were part of creating the evidence that that can be used now in either of those institutions to tailor their work in future. So their kind of insight into all of this is much deeper than any insight you can get from us talking for half an hour, because they were so much a part of the process of doing the research. So that's kind of one of the major benefits, I would say. So if I could go for the next slide, please, and the next one. So in terms of getting started with the getting started one, please, really, thanks. Getting started with working with universities. I think there is a sense of people wanting to work locally, right? So we're all based in at the University of Leeds, and you can tell that a lot of our research is going. We're talking about Leeds and Bradford as key case study areas for us, and people can go further afield than that, but there's a sort of strong sense in the UK that if we're working on UK topics, we will want to work locally, and so that's your first port of call, I would think. But if you're trying to collaborate with people, you might be wanting to look locally. However, there's a really strong steer I would like to make here on the research areas, and that's point 2: the ways in which your interests overlap with the research team. So, for example, we really like working with policymakers, practitioners, activists as a team, but we are particularly keen on collaborations that emphasise the role of social relations in energy demand, as we have done in our presentation. And I think it's really important to know what the interests of the academics are. And it would definitely be the case with us that, if you're not from Leeds or Bradford or West Yorkshire, but you're really inspired by our approach, or you want to collaborate on this sort of relational approach, we would be definitely up for working with you. So it's sort of thinking about who you want to work with according to what your topic interests are, I suppose. And I will leave the rest of the steps there because I think they kind of make a lot of sense and don't need over elaboration. So next slide, please. In terms of considerations, then, academic timelines are really strange. We're often chasing grants, and then when we apply for grants, we often have to wait a very long time to know whether we've run them or not. It's incredibly frustrating for us, especially. We have great ideas, we want to do it now, but we can't really do it until we have the money to do it. So it's worth knowing when you approach an academic, or when an academic approaches you, where they are in the funding cycle. If they're at application stage, you can pretty much think, I'll have a chat with them, maybe commit to something potentially, but that it's going to be a year or so before it gets started. They may come with you with grants already in the bag, in which case it's a very different kind of conversation. So I think it's really worth bearing in mind where people are at. In the field, in terms of outcomes and deliverables, we are quite creative about deliverables. We do need to publish academically. That's part of our kind of metrics for our roles within the university. But for instance, on this project, we've worked with New Economics Foundation to produce a sort of policy-facing briefing around our interests. So we're very sort of open to alternative kinds of outputs. On other projects I've been involved in recently, we produced a cartoon book in the form of a book, and there's all sorts of possibilities for how to communicate the eventual findings that we're usually fairly creative about. In terms of funding, you probably don't need to worry about that. We manage the funding opportunities. We understand the systems. However, if you were to approach us with an idea, it could provoke or stimulate an application. So it could be that we then go with you as partner to the UK Research Council, who potentially will have money available to be funding something that is quite applied. And maybe in terms of the risks, I think the relationship between you and the academic is really critical. So find people that you understand, that you like, that you work well with. It's all about relationships, as is our research, and that's when it works. That's when you will get more out of the partnership than you put in effectively. Next slide, please. I think I'm not going to dwell on this one because this could apply to any projects that you're involved with. I think maybe just to point out that the communication point is the same as I made on the previous slide around finding people you like, you understand, can work well with. And then the next slide, please. In terms of the potential barriers, the funding calendar is really challenging, and I mean the reality is we're often waiting to start until there's money around. We also can't usually start until there is money around because all of us have other parts of our role. We all teach. We have leadership roles within our organisation, and therefore we can only really make space when time is funded effectively. In terms of goals, our goals are sometimes less practical than yours in the sense that we can be about understanding how things work. rather than necessarily, you know, really needing to have that positive outcome. And for us, sometimes failure is a really important learning opportunity, as I'm sure it is for you, but maybe we have less riding on the failure than you do. And so it can end up being as interesting as success in a way. And maybe also to point out around funding, that funding in academic research generally pays for academic time, less often pays for your time and your activities, although there are exceptions for that. I'm involved in a really big EU project at the moment where the practitioner time, so Leeds City Council, again, in that case, their time is absolutely paid for, but it does depend on the funder as to whether they will do that or not. And so it depends what kind of a project it is, effectively. I'm going to skip the rest of this slide and move on to the next one. So just to finish off with some tips and highlights from our work and a bit more broadly, I'll start with the highlights on the right hand side. So I think what we want you to leave with is an understanding that relationships shape when and how people do retrofit. We also want you to know that people don't act rationally about their homes, that they are personal, private spaces that they treat in a very different way, and money that is spent on homes is spent in a particular way as a result. From the work that Anne's been showing, households are really heterogeneous, and so we can't approach them all in the same way. And there's some really interesting opportunities there, I think, for you know, kind of cutting out different populations from the target in terms of getting people to engage in self-funded retrofit. And I think leveraging existing relationships is also really critical in the retrofit context, and actually in lots of contexts around making change that is to do with energy. And then to move to the tips on the left-hand side, we'd like you to be taking into account people, place and money, so to be thinking about that while planning retrofit. Also thinking about the kinds of funds that exist out there that are earmarked correctly, by which we mean that that households see as relevant to spend on retrofit, and then thinking about, well, how could we tap into that in order to generate a larger self-funded retrofit market? That's something we're really fascinated by as a team, and we're hoping to attract funding to explore. And then the two last points are kind of a bit more general. Find your academic partners who have similar questions and interests. And also, this one's coming from Anne, harness the potential of existing spatial data sets. There's a lot of information about people, where they live and who they are out there. And there's some real opportunities through that to kind of understand who you're targeting and what it is they might need and want from any kind of intervention. So I think that's it from us. If you like our approach, we'd be really happy to talk to you, but we're also really happy to take questions today. And more generally, and just to point out, our lovely new website, which we only launched about a week ago, is available there as well, with all our outputs on it, including lots of things that are relatively easy to read. We find quite a few people contact us after reading our academic papers, so I'm sure our writing is fairly accessible. Although I'd probably start with the sort of blog type pieces first.
Great, thank you very much.